We're here today to talk about recycling and the circular economy. The importance of those two things seems to be rising exponentially as the demand for the critical minerals that we need for the energy transition rises. Intuitively, we might think that mining companies' interests aren't really aligned with recycling and the circular economy, given that they'd rather produce more of the primary supply. But what do you see as the key factors that's going to really drive the demand for the circular economy and recycling, and why in particular are mining companies placed well for this?
We all know the numbers in terms of how much supply is needed for these critical minerals. There's varying estimates, so there's no point being stuck on which one is right, but roughly 6 times across the portfolio. So you can't have that supply response from mining. You need as much mining as possible. So I look at it as what I call responsible production. So even if you ramp up all the responsible production you can between now and 2050, we think there's still a gap. It's hard to quantify it, but there's still a gap. So how do you meet that gap is we would like to think is responsible consumption, which is essentially a circular economy. And circular economy is not just recycling, it's product life extension, repair, reuse, all of that. And the very last step is recycling. So it's not at competition with primary mining, unlike what people might like to believe, because you need as much mining as you can responsibly, but you also need to consume more responsibly and have circular ecosystems. So that's on the first point. On the second point, how can mining companies, I think every mining company is different, your portfolio is different. I can only speak for Glencore. So from my point of view, our vantage point, I think comes down to 3 things from our portfolio. One is assets. So we have 2 types of assets. We have assets that have been recycling for a long time. These are very complex metallurgical assets. And so what you can do is you can operate at a massive scale where you blend both the primary feeds and the recycled feeds. And by recycled, I just don't mean number 2 copper. I mean very difficult to process material, sometimes classified hazardous waste and whatnot. So there's an asset base that does that. But the second thing is we have other assets that we have already built that are existing that we can repurpose. 2 quick examples. We have a lead refinery just outside London. We are repurposing parts of it for electronics recycling. You could repurpose parts of it to battery recycling. We are repurposing Porto Westmere, which is our lead zinc asset, to black mass refining. So there's an existing asset base, and that's not exclusive to Glencore. There's many companies that have an existing asset base. So instead of building greenfield, you can pivot and use these existing assets, do much faster. The second point I would say is risk management. So I think recycling is a bit different than mining. So it's not, urban mining is a very fancy term, but you actually, if you look into it, from our experience, to do recycling properly, the risk is very high. And to manage that risk, you need the same skills as commodity trading. Because you're not sitting on a deposit of copper that you know exactly what it is in there and you're mining it and you have a plan. You have to buy this feed. You buy this feed across hundreds of suppliers. You don't really know what you're getting. So you have all kinds of risks in terms of financial risk, counterparty risk, a lot of these risks, which is the same as commodity trading. So our trading DNA helps with the recycling side. And the last thing I would say is, if in a world where you have a lot of primary production going into the energy transition like we have, and a history of recycling, you can easily combine those two to close the loop.
From the copper perspective, how does this question look in terms of both the importance of recycling and why the mining companies are well placed?
Metals value chains are already circular, and obviously mining plays a role in that, because without the stocks from mining, there would be no circular value chain. There would be no stock to recycle. So they're already playing a role. I think historically, though, mining has been left out of the kind of perception of what a circular economy looks like. As Camille just said, and we've heard earlier, there is huge demand, increases expected for many different metals, including copper, and that demand is already being filled by both primary and secondary material, and it will continue to be filled by both, and as it should be. There's many other drivers, I would say, like society's kind of our throwaway society and our kind of the negative perception of mining that still does exist, is driving, what is an attractive concept in a circular economy. So it's nice to think that if we could just be fully circular, we wouldn't have to, you know, dig things out of the ground, cut down trees, for example. But the reality is that we do need both. There's also regulatory drivers. We see that in many different jurisdictions. Europe has a lot of legislation, both around circular economy itself, but also sustainable products, along that do target different aspects of a circular value chain. In Asia, there's also lots of, I would say, circular economy type pieces of legislation in Japan, China, and South Korea, and they're doing it from quite, you know, different perspectives. So there's a supply or availability issue there that is being kind of targeted with those pieces of legislation. In the US, it is slightly different. I think it's more of a carrot rather than a stick like you would get in Europe. But you also have the OEMs that are driving things from the bottom, particularly when we look at targets around recycled content for end-of-life, end-user products. So that's also driving things up the supply chain.
Our business is on traceability in the battery value chain, predominantly in gearing OEMs up for battery passporting, which most of you will know is coming into force from 25 in graduated stages. And the question around what's driving circularity and how this affects miners. The first thing is that in Europe, obviously, recycled content targets for battery materials will sort of step up over time, and in the US exactly the same, where the driver there, of course, is the Inflation Reduction Act, including, for example, the consumer tax credits. And at the same time in Europe, we will expect OEMs using batteries to have a carbon footprint per battery. And that means that quite soon, probably from 2026, we as consumers will be able to compare the embodied carbon in a battery. And the battery in an EV accounts for roughly half the supply chain's contribution to the carbon footprint of manufacturing an electric vehicle. And clearly we're all being encouraged to drive electric vehicles because they're supposed to be better for the planet, and that means also making them more sustainably. So why am I talking about sustainability when we're talking about circularity? Well, recycled battery materials have roughly half the carbon footprint or half the energy requirement to turn scrap into battery-grade materials. Obviously, it depends on what scrap you get, point made by Kunal, but than it does primary supply, and particularly some materials like nickel pig iron being turned into battery-grade materials is enormously energy-intensive. So we're just about to shine a very large light on this. And although I've just talked about Europe and the US, there are similar initiatives coming all over the place in Canada, in India, and in Japan, all driving versions of much the same sort of driver.
Coming from the aluminium side, I mean, the circular economy is in many sense already here. So for the aluminium side, roughly 1/3 of the total metal supply is recycled material. A lot of it's still pre-consumer scrap, but increasingly also a lot of post-consumer scrap coming back. And if you look at more mature markets like Europe and the US, more than 40%, 40 to 45% of the total metal production is based on aluminium scrap. So it's already a significant share of the total metal supply is secondary aluminium and part of the circular economy. Now, going forward, we believe that the growth in the circular part of the market it will be much higher than the growth on the primary side. And as we see it, there are really four main drivers behind this. I think several of them have already been mentioned, but certainly on the customer demand side, a lot more attention on sustainable supplies, on sustainable products. That's certainly driving recycled content requirements from the car makers, for example. Secondary, you also have the regulatory side, inflation or the waste shipment directive in the EU is an example, end-of-life vehicle regulation certainly, and also green claims. I mean, you have several of these regulations in Europe really sort of increasing the request and demand for secondary materials and circular solutions. Thirdly, also geopolitics have been mentioned. If you look at aluminium, more than 1 million tons of unsorted aluminium scrap is exported out of Europe. That is certainly material that can be recycled in Europe. And on the US side, you have more than 2 million tons leaving the US, exported to Asia today. So another sort of mineral base or metal base that you have in those markets. And then the final and the fourth driver is really technology development that can sort of enable these markets to maintain or keep these metal flows within those markets. So there's a lot of investments going into scrap sorting technologies and a lot of investments and technology development. So then you have much more capabilities within the markets to sort scrap and use and recycle scrap within the key markets in Europe and the US.
You almost have to become less of a miner and more of a trader.
Yeah, absolutely. So the answer to your question, whether mining companies can play a role, for our company, that's certainly the situation. I mean, we are an integrated aluminium company and renewable energy company, and we have bauxite mining and refining, aluminium smelting, but also recycling. And more than 50% of our total metal production is based on secondary material. But as was said here, it's a completely different business. It's a very much more commercial business. You have to deal with a lot of small suppliers on the scrap side. Scrap is not scrap. It depends a lot on the quality of what you're buying. So it's a completely different business and a completely different business model you need to have in order to operate in the recycling business compared to the mining business.